Welcome to the X-Perts, your exceptional guides to all things X-Men. I am Jeremy.
I'm Joanna.
And I am Jesse.
We're doing this show in conjunction with Second Union. For more of the latest headlines and entertainment, please go to our website at wearesecondunion.com. Well, it's another week and we have another X-related subject to talk about. In addition to everything else we've discovered so far, we've got new series coming out, or new series announcements seem to come out almost daily regarding the X-Men lately. With the Hellions and X-Corps and Wolverine and Young Cable and now X-Factor being added to the list. But we just did a review of the Marauders over at the Cosmic Library podcast, and just by stroke of luck, one of the major players of the Marauders is our subject of this week for the X-Perts. And that is the X-Man Bishop. That is a guy who... I'm trying to think of the right way to describe it. He's pretty much a combination between what Wesley Snipes was to movies in the 90s and Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah.
Huh.
He's just kind of this tremendous action hero who appeared out of thin air in the 90s in Marvel Comics.
Mm-hmm.
He was actually created in November of 1991. And something I'm surprised about is one of his creators is John Byrne. John Byrne is the artist who did the Dark Phoenix saga and a serious amount of X-Men comics back in the day.
Oh, makes sense.
He co-created the look of it with Will Portasio, who was the artist on Uncanny X-Men at the time. When Bishop first appears, he's not an X-Man. He's a mutant, but like Cable and Prestige, he does not come from the current timeline. He comes from the future. He was born approximately 80 years into the future of the Marvel Universe. And believe it or not, he's actually related to a character we saw recently.
That kid with the sunglasses?
No.
No, nice guess, but no.
Manifold?
No, although I believe that's his father. His grandfather is known as Gateway.
Oh, okay, that was the
okay.
name. That was the character I was looking for.
But Bishop's early life wasn't a happy one. He was the son of Aboriginal mutant refugees who fled to America from Australia a day before Australia was devastated in a nuclear attack in his future. He was actually raised in a mutant concentration camp afterwards. There were concentration camps for mutants after an event known as the Summers Rebellion, where mutants and humans joined forces to destroy Sentinels.
Mm-hmm.
As a result of his time in the concentration camp, that's where that big M brand on Bishop's right eye comes from.
Gotcha. I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, it was used to identify mutants in his timeline. His parents were killed, and Bishop was taken in by a man known only as LeBeau. We know who that is at this point.
Yes.
Remy.
Yeah, so he was raised by a future version of Gambit. At this point, he was also known as the Witness. He was supposedly the last man to see the X-Men alive in his timeline. According to Beau, Bishop's adopted grandmother took Bishop away from him. Bishop also had a sister at this time, who... I don't know what her actual name is. I only knew her as Shard. The two of them were raised by his grandmother within the same mutant concentration camp in Brooklyn. And his grandmother taught him legends about a group of people called the X-Men, who were old allies of hers. She was depowered by unknown means, and she had entered the camps in secret to raise her grandchildren. When she was on her deathbed, she made Bishop promise and swear to protect Shard. And after the rebellion, mutants were emancipated and sent out of the camps to live for themselves. In other words, somebody fought for mutant equality, and it actually worked. Okay? However, at this point, Bishop and Shard were only kids. They were living on the streets and stealing in order to survive. They were pretty much modern, dark versions of Oliver Twist.
Mm-hmm.
Then they came under the care of a family friend who was a war veteran known as Hancock. He was slightly blind, but he took on raising these two. If he looked anything like Will Smith, I will hurt somebody.
I was just thinking, wait, that Ken Cole?
I don't know. I've not seen this. I imagine this was in a mini-series to tell Bishop's origin story. But while Bishop was out and about, he encountered an anti-human group of mutants. Anti-human mutants, called the Exhumes. They took Shard hostage before a group called the X arrived. They were the XSE. XSE stands for the Xavier's Security Enforcers.
Hmm.
Well, they weren't a militant group, they were just kind of the pseudo-military of the time. And up until that point, Bishop admired the Exhums and their anti-human stances. But he also attributed the Exhums to be something similar to the X-Men as he thought they were. It wasn't until the X defeated the Exhums and saved his sister that Bishop wanted to join the X. And while he was 15, Hancock was murdered by criminals who were arrested by the X. And it's at this point that he and Shard enlisted as cadets in their ranks. Believe it or not, Shard blew past Bishop to become the youngest X officer in history. During a training class, Bishop's instructors and some of his fellow students were killed, but Bishop himself rallied the survivors and struggled against the assailants until reinforcements arrived. And it's at this point that Bishop gradually begins to climb the ranks of the X until becoming the commander of the entire unit. So, he was on a mission to wipe out a nest of what was called M-Plates. They were mutant vampires who feed on bone marrow. I imagine that had something to do with the villain M-Plate, who was pretty active during the 90s at this point. M-Plate himself needed to feed off of mutant bone marrow to survive.
Ooh.
I don't think he did so orally. Well, not technically orally. I think he did it through a couple, like, sucker mouths he had in his palms. It's a very strange
So
process.
gross.
Yeah. Shard was critically injured during this period, and Bishop went to the Witness for help. The Witness was imprisoned at the New York Stark Fujikawa building. Sounds like Stark Industries fell in some money troubles.
Mm-hmm.
They agreed to transfer Shard's essence into a holographic matrix if Bishop would work for them for 1 year. In other words, Shard's body wasn't going to last, so they would transfer her mind into an AI template. Bishop agreed to the deal, and he left the X for a while. The details of Bishop's career during this period are lost. Nobody knows what he did. But Bishop himself won't talk about the subject. He even refused to tell the AI version of Shard what he did during this period. After the year was up, he immediately re-enlisted as a member of the X, and he and his group of soldiers were called the Omega Squad. They captured a mutant terrorist called Trevor Fitzroy, who was a murderous former X-trainee in the ruins of the Xavier Institute war room. It was at this point that Bishop's life pretty much changed, because while they were arresting Fitzroy, Bishop found a recording of Jean Grey during the 90s time period where she spoke of a traitor destroying the X-Men from the inside out.
Huh.
Ooh.
So, since Bishop knew the Witness, who was supposedly the last person to see him alive, he went and asked for details, but he only got this weird, ambiguous response. It wasn't anything he could really parse out on his own. So it left Bishop to think that possibly the Witness knew more than he was talking about when it came to the death of the X-Men.
Mm.
Not long after this, Trevor Fitzroy escaped from prison, and he started to drain life forces from other mutants. This is Fitzroy's ability. He would drain life force from mutants and is able to translate that into time portals.
Hmm.
It's not one of those processes that's very easily explained, but he basically killed enough people to form a very large portal, larger than he'd ever done before. And when I say large, I mean through time, not physically. It wasn't just him, though. He also broke out 93 other prisoners. They were called lifers. And Bishop followed Fitzroy through this portal before it closed with the other members of his Omega Squad. And he suddenly found himself in the current time of Marvel Comics, which at this point would again be 1991. Not exactly a cultural revolution.
Mm-hmm.
While in the past, even though they couldn't find a way home, Bishop and Omega Squad forcibly terminated any members of the Lifers they came across, but they could not get to Fitzroy. It's also at this point that Bishop encountered the X-Men for the first time, but I guess his mind wasn't quite parsing out where he was, because he didn't believe that the X-Men were the X-Men. He did fight against the X-Men, but later fought with them to try and stop Fitzroy, which eventually cost him the lives of the other members of Omega Squad, namely Malcolm and Randall. Never really found out what their mutant powers were. They tended to use the same kind of rifles Bishop did.
Mm-hmm.
But after this point, Charles Xavier offered Bishop a place in the X-Men, and he was placed directly under Storm's tutelage.
Of course.
He fought a villain named Styglet. I don't remember this. But it's after this point... Now, I gotta remind you that at this point, this was the first time there had been two teams of X-Men working simultaneously. The Gold and the Blue Squad. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Bishop ended up on the Gold Squad, led by Storm. It had Jean Grey, Colossus, Archangel, and I believe Iceman on it. Pretty good rounded out crew.
Yeah.
The Blue Squad was led by Cyclops. It had Psylocke, Jubilee, Wolverine, Beast, Rogue, and Gambit. So mind you, when Bishop was brought into the X-Men, he hadn't seen most of the X-Men yet. It was after they defeated Styglet that Bishop ran into the X-Men Blue Squad for the first time. And that's when he first laid eyes on Gambit.
Mm-hmm.
Who he immediately recognized as a younger version of the Witness, and called him out by his first name. His last name. The first time Gambit's last name had ever been heard in the current timeline.
Oh.
And it's at this point that Gambit decided he really didn't like this guy who just blurted out people's secrets.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't know him then as Remy LeBeau?
No, Gambit only ever referred to himself as Gambit. He never referred to his first name or his last name. And at this point, even as readers, all we had was Gambit's last name because Bishop used it.
Huh.
We really didn't know what his identity was for a very long time.
I guess I meted myself because I've always known his name on this side of it. I don't know. That's weird.
Okay.
Continue.
Well, not long after this, Bishop had another first encounter that, I wouldn't say was ideal. Because even though he had learned about the X-Men forever, he didn't really know the name Mystique.
Uh-oh.
Ooh.
Yeah. Ended up fighting her for the first time, and he also fought alongside the X-Men when he battled the Morlocks in something called the Death Sponsors. I'm not familiar with that, but it sounds very Mojo.
Yep.
Bishop assigned himself the role of Xavier's personal bodyguard. Remember, where he came from, the X-Men were wiped out by an unknown enemy.
Uh-huh.
He unfortunately didn't do very well as that bodyguard role because Cable's evil clone Strife critically wounded Xavier while he was under Bishop's care. Because it was Strife, a lot of the X-Men believed Cable was the assassin.
Mm.
So Wolverine teamed up with Bishop to track down Cable, but then traveled to Cable's space station at the time, Greymalkin, and then they understood that he didn't do it, so they went looking for Strife. Bishop actually offered to resign from the X-Men because of how well he protected Professor Xavier as his bodyguard.
I mean, he's still alive, right? I mean...
Yeah, it was actually Xavier
mission accomplished.
Yeah, it was Xavier who said his resignation was not necessary. And then Bishop fought with the X-Men again, this time against the Acolytes. They were a group of mutants who pretty much worshipped Magneto as a god.
Yeah.
Now, this is where Bishop's history starts to get kind of janky, because not long after this, Bishop for the first time met Xavier's insane son, Legion, David Haller.
Oh.
And he managed to follow David Haller, who himself used his own powers to travel back in time. I should qualify this. I should qualify this. David Haller as Legion has an unknown amount of mutant abilities.
Mm-hmm.
How you guys are aware of Legion, I assume?
Yeah, I was trying to, every time you say someone's name or call sign, I try to say to myself what their abilities are, and I couldn't for sure say his.
Well, the short version for Legion is that he has an immense amount of mutant abilities, all of which are highly powerful, all of which are instantly accessible. The problem with Legion, though, is that he's known to have a very unstable multiple personality disorder, and often his individual abilities are only specifically accessed or associated by certain personalities in his mind.
Mm-hmm.
So to access those abilities, he often has to pop out a personality associated with it to make it work. Now, time travel is well within Legion's abilities. The problem is, though, is that Legion had the bright idea that to honor his father in the best way possible, he's going to eliminate Eric Lensher, a.k.a. Magneto, before he became Magneto. So he traveled back in time. He had studied Psylocke's psychic knife abilities. He created one. Found the two of them when they were arguing in college early on about their varying mutant ideologies. Rushed at the pair, but Xavier, as a young man, was such a pragmatist and loyal to his friends that he jumped in front of Legion's psychic knife.
Oops.
And Xavier was instead the one who died in the past. This created...
So does he cease to exist, or does that create a paradox?
Well, Legion himself, yes, ceased to exist, but it also created a timeline divergence, because this created a new timeline where Magneto followed Xavier's dying wish to create mutant and human coexistence. Except Magneto is not Xavier. This created the alternative timeline where half of Marvel Comics disappeared and came back with new names, also known as the Age of Apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
This is a creation of a timeline where Apocalypse, because there were no major factions against him, did manage to rise to prominence and ruled most of the world. I think the only countries left were parts of Europe and Great Britain. But it was a global society of mutants, and the strong only survived. So murder was kind of the norm around here. Think the French Renaissance, except less cuddly.
Do you mean the Revolution?
No, I mean the Renaissance. I mean, there were royals, and there were people murdering very freely, except everything was very dirty and dingy. It's like as much stuff rose out of the ashes were still all over the ground. You get what I'm saying here?
Yeah.
So, because of Bishop's unusual circumstance, that he came from an alternative future, he did exist within the Age of Apocalypse, but he kept having flashes of his own timeline.
Mm-hmm.
Both his future, aka his present, and the time he traveled to. Because of Bishop's interference in the Age of Apocalypse, he finally convinced Magneto that they need to go through this plot to try to put the timeline back, even though it was going to cost this Magneto his life and his X-Men. But they followed through with it. They actually managed to send the altered version of Bishop back in time, who himself jumped in front of the psychic knife that accidentally impaled Xavier's chest. I know it sounds very complicated. It's one of those things that makes better sense when you read it.
Fair.
So the timeline reset itself, except every once in a while Bishop keeps getting flashes of his time in the Age of Apocalypse, like his mind can't completely purge this. That has to be hellacious. And this is when things, believe it or not, you thought that was complicated? Things get more complicated for Bishop.
Uh-oh.
After this, another storyline started called The Onslaught.
Oh, no.
Yeah. We found out who the traitor that killed the X-Men was. It was Professor X.
Really?
Yeah, okay. So, between the Age of Apocalypse and the beginning of Onslaught, Xavier and Magneto had an extreme fight. And they've done this a lot through the ages. Except at this point, Xavier has somehow resolved himself to the idea that Magneto will never seek out any form of coexistence. And he's always going to fight against this idea. Therefore, Xavier had to remove him from the equation entirely. Xavier actually used his psychic powers to shut down Magneto's mind. Except, think of this as the pride before the fall, because once Xavier pulled this trigger, it kind of caused this cascading effect in his mind. Not that Xavier himself was evil, but because now it had actually split his mind to such a degree that he accidentally created this separate entity. It was made up entirely of psychic energy, but it had Magneto-like armor, and it called itself Onslaught.
Oh.
Like Xavier's super ego suddenly made itself real and murderous, and Onslaught is the thing that killed the X-Men.
Oh, okay, that makes more sense.
Right, but because Bishop is here, he is the unknown entity who actually knows this future. So when Onslaught gave its first burst, which, in his timeline, again, killed the X-Men, Bishop used his energy manipulation and absorption abilities and jumped in front of the psi wave meant for the X-Men. After this, Onslaught left because he thought he had taken care of them all, but because Bishop absorbed enough of the energies, it only knocked them out.
How did he fare?
He was woozy, but he was alright. Bishop did lose consciousness after the blast, but it wasn't enough to prevent Onslaught from nearly destroying all of humanity. However, now that Bishop knew who the traitor among the X-Men was, he stopped accusing Gambit of every other thing that went wrong in his life. So, after this, Bishop spent time in a possible distant future. This was detailed in a miniseries called Bishop, the Last X-Man. He was again chasing Trevor Fitzroy through time. And believe it or not, he was returned to the present by Apocalypse. Apparently, Bishop's powers was known as one of the 12. Do you know what the 12 are?
No.
Okay, so...
Only vaguely.
One of Apocalypse's schemes to take over the world was that he was aware of 12 mutants whose powers, when he combined them in his own form, when he absorbed them more or less, would create the ultimate being that would be damn near unstoppable. This included a number of different characters, including the Living Monolith and Cyclops, and evidently Bishop made that list. It probably had to do with his energy absorption and redirection abilities. I mean, when you can absorb as much energy as he takes and turns into a kinetic blast, that's useful.
Oh, yeah.
But I guess he survived this whole thing. But Bishop was finally returned to the present permanently during the Maximum Security crossover. And I'm sorry, that's one of the few things I'm not currently aware of. I'm going to have to look that up.
Me either.
Well, I might as well do that right now, otherwise it leaves a big hole. Maximum Security was a company-wide crossover event that ran through a 3-issue self-titled limited series, and it was put out in either 2000 or 2001. Basically, alien civilizations that had interacted with Earth joined forces to prevent humans from further interfering in galactic affairs. And to do that, they designated Earth as a penal colony.
Oh.
In other words, nobody on Earth was allowed to leave Earth. This is apparently where Bishop returned at.
Oops.
Well, I mean, if you're looking for a guy to lead a jailbreak, he's a good one.
True story.
Yeah. After he returned to Maximum Security, several X-Men apparently started to disagree with Xavier's quest for things called the Books of Destiny. You guys are familiar with the precog Destiny in the X-Men, right?
Yeah.
She was physically blind. She was a precog who saw all kinds of futures up until the moment someone died.
Mm-hmm.
But her powers were kind of wild. She would get precognitions that were potential timelines, things that may not happen, things that may have already happened, things that are unavoidable.
Mm-hmm.
And she couldn't parse them all out in her head, so instead of trying, she just kind of wrote these haphazard volumes of books of everything she was seeing.
Oh.
So as you can imagine, that information could be vital depending on who picks it up. You know, if you can figure out Destiny's writings well enough, you can goose events to create the futures you want.
Mm-hmm.
Certain X-Men did not trust Xavier currently to gather up these tomes. They didn't know what he was going to do with it. So Storm led a splinter group of X-Men called the X-Men Extreme. Again, it's the 90s.
Right.
Yeah,
But
I remember.
It was a pretty solid cast, though. I mean, it was Psylocke, it was Betsy Braddock in her Japanese form, Beast, Bishop, the third Thunderbird, who was, I believe he threw plasma energy, and a couple other characters they picked up late in the series. It eventually included, like, Rachel Grey, Shadowcat, and I believe Cannonball.
Wasn't Sage among that, too?
Yeah, you're right. Sage was their information gatherer.
Yeah.
But this series didn't last terribly long in its current form. And after that, Bishop stopped being an X-Man altogether, and he joined the FBI.
Huh.
You guys probably aren't familiar with the short-lived series of District X.
No.
There was a section...
Sounds interesting, though.
It had possibilities, but it's kind of a hard sell to comic book fans. Let me explain. Bishop was hired by the FBI to specifically patrol a subsection of New York known as Mutant Town. It was run down, but had a high population density of mutants. So instead of having a bunch of police or human FBI agents, doing law enforcement there, they hired Bishop specifically to handle the mutant affairs issues. It's not a bad concept.
No, it's not.
But you're talking about an X-Man who's never been the most popular of fans doing police work. Not a great sell to comic book readers, you know what I mean? I think if you represented that today, it'd be cool, but we've moved well beyond the days of Mutant Town in New York.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the next major point Bishop showed up was in the X-Men miniseries related to the Civil War. Where do you think Bishop ended on the idea of superhero registration?
No.
Australia?
Believe it or not, he was for it.
Really?
What?
Actually, no.
He agreed with Iron Man's side. He believed that superhumans should be registered and not necessarily controlled, but at the very least regulated. Cyclops and Emma Frost disagreed with that, so he ended up kind of on the outs with them. He actually was a member of the... for a short time, he was on the security guards for the 42 prison that was used in the miniseries.
Huh.
How do you like that?
Interesting.
Yeah. He did team up with the X-Men later to save the 198, the remaining mutants, after the decimation from a bomb explosion. And then he went on his own way. This is when he worked specifically for Iron Man during the Civil War, although he didn't really come into conflict with a whole lot of X-Men during this period.
Yeah, most of the X-Men kind of checked out of that event.
They mostly kept themselves above it because they didn't see humans really giving a crap when mutants were dying or being depowered. So Emma and Scott, who were leading the X-Men, did keep the X-Men out of their affairs. But that didn't stop particular individuals who felt strongly from getting involved. Bishop got involved on Iron Man's side. Storm and Cable got involved on Captain America's side. Go figure, right?
Yeah.
The podcast you're listening to is part of the Second Union Podcast Network. You can listen, like, and subscribe to all our podcasts by heading over to wearesecondunion.com. Thank you for listening.
Now, after this, even though Bishop was on the outs, he was still pretty much an X-Man. He just didn't agree with them. Everything changed with an event called the Messiah Complex. Now, remember, we are post-decimation. The Scarlet Witch had said the magic words, no more mutants. No more mutants were being created. They were dying. There was approximately 300 left in the world, even including the X-Men. Now, where Bishop comes from, there was something very, very bad that happened. Remember, mutants were subjugated, right?
Yeah.
Concentration camps. In the timeline he came from, a lot of it stemmed from something called the 6-Minute War. A young redhead with very high powers of some sort created a massacre because of a flare of their powers.
Ooh.
Ooh.
I know, that sounds really familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Except it wasn't her. Jean Grey's been dead for a while by this point. Still not back. Except in Messiah Complex, there was one mysterious thing that happened in the middle of this era where mutants could not be born. One was. And the birth of this mutant in Alaska, the energy burst from this birth destroyed the hospital.
Holy cow.
Oh, wow.
It was a young red-headed girl. So as you can imagine, that set off all kinds of warning bells in Bishop's head.
Uh-huh.
And instead of asking anyone to help him, Bishop went on a murder mission. He is going to try to prevent his timeline from happening by killing a baby. Now, I do not condone this in any way.
No.
But I will say that this storyline created a lot of character growth for Bishop, because for the first time since he really arrived, he has a central mission. He's trying to stop a massacre by killing one person.
Right.
But before he can get close enough to kill the baby, believe it or not, he was stopped by the Marauders. Mr. Sinister wanted this baby. Mr. Sinister, as a geneticist, is just intrigued by the idea of this one mutant that's been born in an era where mutants can't be born.
Not to mention a high-powered mutant.
Yeah. So that meant Bishop was suddenly on the periphery as the Marauders and the X-Men were both fighting over control of this infant. And the X-Men were so desperate to find out more about this mutant and where they came from, they actually sent one of Jamie Madrox's clones, along with a very young Layla Miller, through a time machine into the future.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the thing was, Layla Miller, as a child, purposefully went because she knew it was going to be a trip that she could not return from. She killed Jamie Madrox's duplicate once they found out the information on this child, so that the knowledge could pass back through the time stream to Madrox Prime.
Whoa.
Sure, we'll say that works.
Yeah, right. But the information that they found, though, was that they found a very young mutant named Lucas Bishop, who was very angry with this redhead. and was willing to kill it if it ever got the opportunity. So suddenly everyone is on to the idea that Bishop has, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, the X-Men attempted to form an X-Force the X-Men formed an X-Force, a group of mutant hunters, to find this child. And then the X-Men tried to tell X-Force about Bishop's potential betrayal, but Bishop was already working with his team and had managed to block all communication channels. And Bishop found Cable attempting to escape into the time stream with the baby at Muir Isle. The two of them fought. They're both attacked by something called Predator X, which is something humans made specifically to hunt and eat mutants. And while they're fighting amongst themselves, the Predator rips off Bishop's right arm.
Whoa.
Yeah. Believe it or not, Bishop manages to cauterize a wound on the body of an unconscious Sunfire who's still burning hot at this point.
Huh.
And he attempts to shoot Cable before he disappears in the time stream. But unfortunately, Cable does disappear, the shot continues sailing, and it hits a certain man between the eyes named Charles Xavier.
Oops.
Oh gosh, yes. he nearly killed Professor X. And I say nearly because after this he was taken to a doctor and Magneto who used their combined talents and abilities to rebuild Xavier's gray matter, except everything was scrambled and he didn't have his own set of memories at this point. Xavier spent a very long time trying to rediscover himself. So, going back to Bishop chased Cable through the time stream for this child. He still thinks that if this child is allowed to survive, it's going to create a future that is just nightmarish. And I don't know if he wants to wipe himself out or just plain save people, but either way, Bishop is determined to kill this child. Except he can't see the villain he's turning into.
Of course not.
He stole a prototype cybernetic arm from Forge. Punched him in the face, too, to do it. Then stole a prototype time slide device, a time travel device from Forge, and implanted it in the arm. So he is literally chasing Cable through the time stream. And then, after a few near misses, Bishop actually teams up with Strife, Cable's clone, to try to kill this child. And the deal is, you help me kill this child, I will help you kill Apocalypse.
Whoa.
And then, Bishop gets so obsessive about doing this when he figures out that when somebody can bounce throughout time and space, it's very difficult to track them down. So how do you narrow their possibilities?
Good where they were established in the timeline.
Worse.
Travel back to when they were a baby?
No, Bishop started to create engineered genocides to limit the places that Cable and this baby could hide.
Are you serious? What a psychopath.
Is he responsible for the technovirus?
No. It's a little more diluted than that. According to the way he thinks, if he can kill this baby, the entire timeline will disappear and all those people will be back anyway.
What?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's how he parsed it out in his head. And he had been chasing Cable so long, that baby grew to an adolescent. And a young teenager. That baby, you guys actually know who that is.
Hope Summers?
Yes.
Wow.
The mutant with the ability to copy any other mutant ability.
Yeah.
So, no. That's a subject for another time.
Yeah. So, I mean, he had several near misses trying to kill this child, but it never really worked out. And the scary thing is, towards the end of this particular storyline, Cable finally has... Cable's time-bouncing device was destroyed, and Bishop was always not long behind them with some kind of plan or something, right?
Uh-huh.
Cable managed to sabotage Bishop's own time-traveling device that caused his cybernetic arm to explode. Left him stranded in the year 6700 AD.
What?
Yeah. Bishop was actually last seen in this timeline thinking to himself that he was as much of a father to that girl as Cable was. I don't know when, but it appears at some point while he was chasing him, he just resigned himself to showing her the worst of what they could be in hopes that she could be something better. It was very twisted logic at the time.
Yeah. Very.
Without much explanation, in Uncanny X-Force Volume 2, Number 1, Bishop appears back in the current timeline, which at this point is 2013. the means that brought him back were not technological; they were mystical. Something else survived all the way to the year 6700 AD.
What?
Even despite all the weird, chronal genocides that Bishop engineered to try and make this work. Are you familiar with a new mutants enemy called the Demon Bear?
No, but
No.
what the heck?
It is an actual evil spirit. It first appeared in the New Mutants series. And it is like a Native American spirit. It is a marauding, literal demon bear.
Huh.
And it inhabit Bishop's body and then pushed him back in the time stream so that it had a ride back to the present.
Oh no.
Yeah. Psylocke managed to yank this entity out of Bishop's mind, and then Storm used her powers of lightning to disrupt the electrical signals of Bishop's mind, holding his hunt for Hope. In other words, she scrambled his memories as to what he was doing for all this time.
Oh boy.
So Bishop was comatose for a while, but he eventually regained his memories of Hope. And believe it or not, because of the time he spent lodged in the future, he had actually learned more self-control and was no longer interested in murdering this kid.
Well, good. Lesson learned.
Oh no, it was even further than that. Even though he remembered Hope, when Strife appeared in the present, and he was fighting with Hope and Bishop, Bishop did his best to save that child.
Weird.
How do you like that?
That's a lot of flip-flopping for my liking.
It is a bit. I mean, it's kind of weird how it seems like every time Bishop can settle into just kind of a superheroic life, he has this bizarre mission that's put in front of him.
He's like, wait, let me go kill something.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, the next time we see him is in Astonishing X-Men, where he's given himself the mission of constantly reading current events and periodicals to try to figure out which of his remembered genocides is coming to pass next. Or apocalypses, I should say.
Oh no.
And not the ones he creates, just the ones he can remember from his own studying of history, his history. And in this case, the next genocide was the attack of the Shadow King in London. This is the Astonishing X-Men that saw Professor Xavier return as the entity known as X and took over Phantom X's body.
Yeah.
Yeah. God, I think this was also the period that Bishop remembers something called the Mind Killer Apocalypse, when Proteus was brought back.
Proteus.
Do you remember Proteus?
Yes.
Joanna?
Yes.
Yeah, when your power is to affect all of reality, you're generally not the hero of the story. But because
Or you could be, because you're affecting reality.
Yeah, but when you affect reality, there really isn't a fight. You just snap and it goes away.
Alright, Thanos.
However, because of Bishop's intervention, they managed to stop both the Shadow King and Proteus during this 12-issue series.
Mm-hmm.
Xavier, again, known as X at this point, decided to give all of the X-Men except for Psylocke a gift. And his gift to Bishop was I guess you could say a psionic nudge to stop worrying so much about the future and just kind of enjoy yourself in the present a bit more.
Oh, so kind of mind twisted him?
I wouldn't say mind twisted him. I guess it's maybe for the first time Bishop has more of a compunction to just chill than worry about his next job.
So he told him Hakuna Matata?
Something like that, yeah. Yeah, but after this, Bishop got a warning that apparently came from the kid version of Cable we've seen recently about an unspecified imminent event that was going to have serious consequences for the X-Men's timeline. It led him to the body of an Age of Apocalypse escapee known as the Sugar Man.
Sugar Man? What the heck is up with these names?
The Sugar Man was an Age of Apocalypse villain, and he ran child labor camps in the Age of Apocalypse.
Oh.
Ooh.
He was a size changer as well as a density controller. If you looked at him, he looked like a head with 6 arms and legs.
Creepy.
But he had a long prehensile tongue. He was just kind of a walking nightmare. And he escaped into the regular timeline. I can't remember the exact means. It was via a portal of some sort. I think he tagged along with Bishop by shrinking down and hiding in his boot. However, that also meant he was free in the current timeline, and there wasn't a lot of defenses for something like that. He was harassing the Generation X kids a lot. But the thing that killed the Sugar Man was the Nate Gray from the Age of Apocalypse, who used a celestial life seed on himself to boost his own abilities.
Ooh.
This created another alternative timeline, but this one was known as the Age of X, or the Age of the X-Man. It was Nate's version of an idealized world, somehow, and he had pulled all the X-Men into it, just the X-Men. So the world itself didn't end or shift in the creation of this. Nate had a very bizarre idea, because his idea for an idyllic world and one where everyone could coexist was a world without love. A world without personal relationships. Like, characters didn't even know if they had brothers or sisters, somehow.
That's lame.
They were all coming out of birthing pods. Except, I think Nate kind of underguessed the value that the X-Men have and the connection that they possess with each other. Then he also kind of underguessed Bishop's ability to see through alternative timelines. He kept getting ghost images of not just his regular timeline life, but also his life as part of the Age of Apocalypse. It allowed him to see through the whole thing. So beyond that, this is where we come to the present, where Bishop is part of the Marauders. And he's been forcibly conscripted to be the Red Bishop of the Hellfire Trading Company.
What a ride.
I kind of want to see him in a red suit. But
basically his old suit, just like red and black instead of like, what, yellow and blue?
I don't know if I mean superhero costume, or I don't know if I mean like Dr. Dre with dreads. I don't know.
Well, his old costume uniform was mostly blue with little hints of red and yellow, correct?
Yes. It was blue and gold. The only red on it was the X symbol he wore.
Yeah, well, I said little bits.
He also had that bizarre neckerchief he wore.
Yeah.
So, I couldn't say for sure. His history is not as long as the others we've discovered so far, but it is way more complicated when you start getting into the weird time aspect of it all.
Wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey.
Yeah, very much so. He's one of the few characters that's been like an absolute hero and absolute villain within his own story. And I did read the Cable series where Bishop was chasing him and that baby through the time stream.
Really?
I've been a Bishop fan since the character came out, not for any particular reason, but because I always found his story kind of compelling. And even as he's chasing this child, it was just one of those cases where I think I was reading it because I wanted to see where this ended, but I also wanted to see if Bishop would learn.
Yeah.
And he did, but very slowly.
Hey, but he learned.
Eventually, yeah. I don't know, it's not as compelling as the others we've read, but yeah, it has its own twisted tale to it.
Yes.
Definitely.
I hope you feel like you learned something.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you, at what point was he, I don't know if he's married to or just with Storm? Like, where did that fall in?
Never really did. It's been heavily hinted at throughout various series that he would have something personal with Storm. I don't know if that was some kind of automatic projection that fans placed on it, though, just because he and Storm were the lone African Americans on the X-Men.
I thought he was Aboriginal.
Well, he is, but you're right. I'm sorry. The lone black characters on the X-Men, I should say.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a terrible reason to pair them up.
It is.
That is a terrible reason.
It does seem to be that kind of assumption a lot of people made. There were always hints of them possibly being very personal, but it always broke down very quickly because when you think about it, Bishop is a very, very rigid, militaristic individual, whereas Storm is a practical religious figure.
Yeah.
The two are not going to naturally get along. The few times that they've been
opposites attract.
I know, but the few times they've been close together, it's generally so that they can fool cameras while Bishop passes Storm a gun.
Right. I just remember like a few romantic overtones here and there, just not anything big like she had with T'Challa. So
yeah,
it never really played out. Storm has been personal during the period Bishop has been around with both Wolverine and T'Challa at different points, as well as occasionally rekindling what she had with Forge. To my knowledge, Bishop has never really had a romantic entanglement of any sort that I can think about.
At least no formal one.
There may have been some off-the-pages times where he entertained himself, but yeah, he's never really carried a relationship that I'm aware of.
He's too much of a career man.
Yeah.
You mean he obsesses over his self-imposed missions?
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
That's the way I'm putting it.
Bishop's abilities, though, his energy redirection, I think early on they were kind of underserved because all they show is him like absorbing energy blast and then throwing it back out. Later writers had it so that he could absorb all kinds of energy, including like ambient energy, kinetic energy. As fast as he doesn't build it up fast, but when he does build it up, he can release it in almost explosive and sometimes imaginative ways.
Mm-hmm.
He did use the force of a fall from a skyscraper at one point to create these energy blasts that acted like a pseudo parachute.
So the impact of free fall gives him energy.
Yes.
Ha.
And
maybe not the impact, but the wind rush. Yeah.
Yeah. The
momentum?
The kinetic impact upon his body, yeah. Just the act of him hitting aerial friction was enough to create energy absorption. But
that's awesome.
Bishop is also unusually aware of his surroundings. I will never forget that in the first issue of Extreme X-Men, they were in Italy looking for one of the Destiny books. They were knocked out by the Italian government, who placed them in this kind of weird maze with traps to test their abilities and understand who they were dealing with. They had the names, but they didn't exactly have a lot of ideas to how to deal with the X-Men themselves. And when Bishop woke up, he was aware of exactly how long he'd been unconscious. Because of the taste in his mouth, he was aware of exactly which drug was used. And he was also aware that someone had removed all of his equipment, including his weapons, but put them back on him. The guy is just unusually aware of himself.
Yeah, I'll say.
Honestly, the only thing I really remember about X-Men Extreme books was a cover art of Bishop and stocked up with guns, and he's holding a revolver. I mean, like a true life revolver wouldn't handle it at all, with a magazine popping out of the grip.
Mm-hmm.
That is physically impossible.
I don't know. I know about automatic revolvers, but that's about all I know. They do exist, yeah. I know. I hung out in a gun shop for a while when I knew a guy, but I didn't have a need for it. I will say, though, that the funniest line I've ever heard attributed to Bishop was also in Extreme X-Men #1. When the Italian scientists were studying him, they just said, "What did you learn about this guy?" "Well, not much. His ID says his name is Bishop, and he's carrying more guns than a Schwarzenegger film."
Nice.
So I hope you've had fun with this. I put a little bit of thought into what to talk about next week, and I think we need to talk a villain.
I was just thinking that.
We haven't talked about an X-Men villain.
I have a thought.
Which?
Okay.
Mystique.
Yeah, that's who I was pointing at.
Too.
That's who I was pointing at because she has a rich history with several people that aren't just X-Men.
True.
You know,
she was kind of.
She started out as a Miss Marvel villain.
Oh. Really?
Yeah. She was one of Carol Danvers' worst early enemies.
Go figure. I didn't remember that about her.
Learn something, eh?
But it was either her or I thought about it as something to kind of ease herself into the villain is using Quicksilver.
Oh yeah.
Maybe, but Quicksilver I think would be even more complicated considering his time as an Avenger, and a Brotherhood member, and an X-Factor member twice.
Exactly.
No, I think
one that I would like to put on the list for an eventual analysis is Danny Moonstar.
Oh, geez. The Valkyrie.
Digging up some, huh?
She's a Valkyrie.
Right, but she was an X-Men first.
No, I mean she's both. I'm still not very clear as to what. I still don't know if her mutant abilities have been restored. I would imagine so. But she was one of those characters who lost her powers and never came back, even after the undoing of the decimation.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, Krakoa's broken just about every rule we've come across so far, so she's probably powered again.
Of course.
Yeah.
This podcast is part of the Second Union Podcast Network. You can listen, like, and subscribe to all our podcasts by heading over to wearesecondunion.com. Thank you for listening.
So next week we will do Mystique. I hope you guys have had fun, and I hope you found out something you didn't know before.
Mm-hmm.
and we will talk a villain. Thank you very much for tuning in. I am Jeremy.
I'm Joanna.
And I am Jesse.
And you've just been expertly informed.